We often hear the phrase, a nation of immigrants. It's core to the American identity, right?
Absolutely. The melting pot idea.
Yet, if you look at the history, there's this constant, powerful thread of suspicion, even outright hostility towards newcomers.
It's a real paradox, isn't it? How can both things be true?
Exactly. And that's what we want to unpack today. How do we make sense of that?
We'll be drawing on a pretty comprehensive book that really digs into the history of xenophobia in America. It shows how it started, how it evolved, and who the targets were over time.
And it's quite a range of groups, isn't it? Different origins, different faiths.
Oh, definitely. And for anyone listening who wants to maybe reflect more on these kinds of complex topics, check out Mindful Moments on our YouTube channel. It uses AI to analyze significant books, really gets you thinking.
That sounds useful. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Where does this story pick up in the book?
Well, maybe surprisingly, it goes way back to the early colonial period, even before the U.S. was the U.S. And one of the first examples involves German immigrants in Pennsylvania. Benjamin Franklin, of all people.
Benjamin Franklin.
Yes.
Yeah.
He actually expressed concerns, worried they might outnumber the English settlers and fundamentally change the colony's character.
Wow, I wouldn't have expected that. So how did that play out?
It's interesting because despite those initial anxieties, the Germans were eventually, largely accepted.
Why the shift?
A big part of it was how that idea of whiteness started to work. Germans were European, seen as white, and they provided needed labor. They were also seen as a buffer against Native American populations on the frontier.
Ah, so whiteness became this kind of unifying category, even if there were initial tensions within it.
Exactly. It offered a path to inclusion for European immigrants. But, and this is crucial, it happened at the same time that Native Americans were being defined as fundamentally foreign in their own lands.
Right. Displaced, controlled, a completely different track.
Precisely. So you see this racial hierarchy forming very early on. Whiteness wasn't automatic for all Europeans at first, but it became the key differentiator.
Okay, so fears existed even among Europeans early on. But then things really ramped up in the 19th century, didn't they, with different groups?
Yes, the mid-19th century is a major turning point. You have the massive influx of Irish immigrants driven by the potato famine. And this triggers a huge wave of anti-Catholic feeling.
Anti-Catholicism, specifically.
Very specifically. Prominent figures like Lyman Beecher, ministers, writers, they start arguing that Catholicism itself was incompatible with American values.
That was the argument.
Yeah.
That it was anti-democratic.
Essentially, yes. That it was loyal to a foreign power, the Pope, and that its hierarchical structure was opposed to American Protestantism and Republican ideals. It was framed almost like a foreign plot.
A plot. That sounds familiar, that kind of rhetoric echoing later on.
It does. This fear that newcomers bring dangerous alien values that could undermine the nation, it's a recurring theme.
And this wasn't just talk, right? It led to actual conflict.
Absolutely. Irish and also German Catholic immigrants faced serious discrimination. There was violence riots in cities like Philadelphia, Louisville. Bloody Monday in Louisville was particularly bad. It was dangerous.
Was there a political movement around this?
Yes. The Know Nothing Party emerged directly from this sentiment. They were secretive at first, hence the name, but they gained significant political power for a time.
What do they want?
Their main goals were things like restricting voting rights for immigrants, making it harder to become a citizen, extending the naturalization period. They had some success, but the party itself eventually faded.
Okay, so anti-Catholicism was a major force mid-century. Then, as we move later into the 19th century, the focus shifts again.
It does, towards the West Coast and specifically towards Chinese immigrants.
Driven by economics.
Largely, yes. Economic competition, especially in California with the gold rush and railroad construction, combined with really virulent racist ideas about Chinese people being inferior, unassimilable.
And were there laws targeting them specifically?
Oh, yes. Discriminatory laws piled up. Things like the foreign miners license tax, which disproportionately hit Chinese miners. Laws preventing them from testifying against white people in court. It created systemic disadvantages.
And this led to a really significant piece of federal legislation.
It did. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. This was a watershed moment.
Why so significant?
It was the very first time the U.S. passed a law explicitly barring an entire group based purely on their race and national origin. It specifically excluded Chinese laborers.
And the justification was?
National security, believe it or not. But it also required things like registration, certificates, basically creating a system of surveillance and control specifically for this group.
What was the experience like for those trying to navigate this? I've heard of Angel Island.
Angel Island, yeah. It was the processing center, mainly for Asian immigrants near San Francisco. Unlike Ellis Island, detentions there could be incredibly long, interrogations were harsh, the poems carved into the walls by detainees, they're heartbreaking. A real testament to the trauma of that exclusion.
A stark contrast to the Statue of Liberty narrative.
A very stark contrast. And beyond the legal exclusion, there is violence, communities being driven out. It was a period of intense persecution.
So after targeting the Chinese, did attention shift back to Europe at the turn of the 20th century?
It did, but towards different Europeans, the so-called new immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, Italians, Jews, Poles, Slavs.
And the old anxieties resurfaced.
Resurfaced and intensified, but now framed in explicitly racial terms, using sort of pseudo-scientific theories. Groups like the Immigration Restriction League popped up in Boston.
What was their argument?
They believed, based on eugenics ideas, that these new immigrants were racially inferior to the older stock, the Anglo-Saxon Protestants. They feared these groups would dilute the American race.
Were there prominent voices pushing this?
Oh, yes. Madison Grant was a major figure. His book, The Passing of the Great Race, was incredibly influential. He argued for Nordic racial superiority and warned that America was being submerged by these supposedly lesser races from Southern and Eastern Europe.
And did these ideas actually influence policy, like the Chinese Exclusion Act did?
Directly. First, they pushed for literacy tests, arguing it would weed out undesirable immigrants. And then came the big ones, the Immigration Acts of 1921 and especially 1924.
What did the 1924 Act do?
It established the national origins quota system. This system drastically limited immigration based on population numbers from decades earlier, before many Southern and Eastern Europeans had arrived.
So it was deliberately designed to favor immigrants from Northern and Western Europe.
Absolutely. It was explicitly discriminatory, meant to preserve a specific racial and ethnic makeup. People like Madison Grant actually celebrated it as a victory for Native Americans.
This pattern of scapegoating, did it continue into the 20th century? Especially during hard times.
Definitely. The Great Depression is a prime example. With mass unemployment, immigrants became an easy target.
Who was targeted then?
Primarily Mexicans and Mexican Americans. Even though they had been a crucial labor source, especially in agriculture, suddenly they were blamed for taking jobs.
So what happened? Were they deported?
There were these so-called repatriation campaigns. And while some people did leave voluntarily, many others were coerced, pressured, or outright deported.
Even U.S. citizens?
Yes, that's a critical point. Thousands of American citizens of Mexican descent were swept up in this and forced out of the country purely based on their ethnicity. Little distinction was made between documented immigrants, undocumented immigrants, and citizens.
Just based on looking Mexican?
Pretty much. It was racially motivated expulsion driven by economic panic. It created immense fear and upheaval in Mexican communities across the Southwest and Midwest.
Then comes World War II. And perhaps the most infamous example.
You mean the incarceration of Japanese Americans?
Yeah.
Yes. After Pearl Harbor, long-simmering anti-Japanese racism just exploded.
Fueled by fears of espionage.
Fears of disloyalty, espionage, sabotage, but deeply rooted in existing racist stereotypes. Decades of prejudice laid the groundwork.
And this led to Executive Order 9066.
Correct. Signed by President Roosevelt, it authorized the military to designate areas from which any or all persons may be excluded. And it was applied almost exclusively to Japanese Americans on the West Coast.
Forcibly removed from their homes.
Yes. Over 110,000 people, 2/3 of whom were American citizens, were rounded up and sent to desolate incarceration camps for years.
What was the official reason given?
Military necessity. But internal documents and later investigations showed there was no real evidence of a threat. It was driven by racism, war hysteria, and frankly, a failure of political leadership.
You hear quotes from the time.
Like General DeWitt, the head of the Western Defense Command, saying, "A Jap is a Jap." It reveals the blatant racism underlying the policy.
Oh.
And it wasn't just U.S. citizens. Japanese Latin Americans were even brought from South America to be incarcerated here.
Unbelievable. So even after the war, and later civil rights reforms.
Yeah.
Did this kind of thing just stop? The 1965 Immigration Act was supposed to fix the quotas, right?
It did eliminate the discriminatory national origins quotas, which was huge. It opened the door to immigration from Asia, Africa, Latin America in ways that hadn't been possible before.
But xenophobia didn't just disappear.
No, it adapted. The focus shifted. Instead of targeting national origins so overtly, you started seeing more anxiety focused on illegal immigration, particularly from Latin America.
Like Proposition 187 in California in the 90s.
Exactly, trying to deny public services to undocumented immigrants. And you still had intellectuals and politicians making distinctions between good immigrants, often implicitly coded as white or European, and bad immigrants.
And enforcement ramped up.
Significantly. Deportations increased under various administrations, both Democratic and Republican, through the late 20th and early 21st centuries.
And then 9/11 happened.
Yes, and that triggered a massive wave of Islamophobia. Muslim Americans, or people perceived to be Muslim, suddenly faced intense suspicion, surveillance, profiling, negative stereotypes became widespread.
Getting back to those earlier patterns of linking a whole group to a perceived foreign threat.
Precisely. It fits the historical pattern. And of course, more recently, we've seen rhetoric from figures like Donald Trump that explicitly draws on these long-standing xenophobic themes, building walls, travel bans.
So looking back at all this history, this book really lays out how this isn't new. This tension, this fear of the outsider, it's been there all along.
It really has. It's a persistent, adaptable force that changes its targets based on the anxieties of the time, economic insecurity, war, cultural change. Understanding this history helps you see the recurring patterns.
It helps make sense of how we got here, you know?
Exactly. It shows that xenophobia isn't an aberration. It's woven into the fabric of American history, right alongside the ideal of being a nation of immigrants. We really encourage you to keep exploring these issues. You can find more analyses like this on our podcasts.
And if you want to go deeper into the history we've touched on, definitely consider getting the book. We'll put a link in the description. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Share this with someone you think would find it interesting.
And most importantly, keep thinking critically about the stories we tell ourselves about who belongs and who doesn't.
Yeah. Maybe consider this. How does knowing this long history change how you view debates about immigration happening right now?